Hello everybody, here is Franco La Muerte. In this video tutorial I will introduce you to the Oberheim SEM V synthesizer from Arturia, which is an emulation of the real Oberheim synthesizer expander module created by Thomas Elroy Oberheim in 1974. Without further ado, let's make a big bounce in history and let's spend time on the Arturia replica. The central section here represents the heart of the synthesizer with its two oscillators, its multimode filter section, its envelopes, and its LFO. It represents what is the real Oberheim SEM V from 1974. The rest of the synthesizer's interface here shows new intelligent functions added by Arturia. On it can be found a Sub Oscillator, a second LFO, an effect section including an overdrive type distortion, a chorus, a delay, an output that has a soft clipping function. Near the keyboard we can see the arpeggiator section, a function to finely tune the synthesizer as well as a portamento. That's all? Not quite. Arturia made us a little surprised by giving us the possibility to open a panel here in the back from which hides an advanced multi-envelope follower, a modular 8-voice programmer providing the possibility to make the Oberheim SEM V multi-timbral in a very original way. You can also find a modulation matrix providing, for that matter, numerous synthesis possibilities of this magnificent little sound beast. On the right of the modulation windows here, you find the three interfaces of the three effects. To conclude, at the top is found the classic preset bar. You can find here several presets made by various artists and designers of sound synthesis. You may of course also save your own presets, as you can export and import preset banks. This switch enables to pass the synthesizer in mono or polyphonic mode. You will find here the CPU gauge and at the very right the MIDI button, permitting to parameter the MIDI assignments with much ease. Let's see now a little more in detail the modules found at the heart of this Arturia Oberheim SEM V. I must say, however, that this video's goal is not to explain in detail every mechanism of sound synthesis world as such, though despite this voluntary limitation, I will make sure each time to provide the essential there is to know about this synthesizer. If you are a real beginner in sound synthesis, I suggest you read the little tutorial on synthesis in your Arturia manual books, or to study some of my written and video tutorials in which I break down the synthesis mechanisms with more pedagogical depth. The Art of the Synthesizer Expander Module section proposes two oscillators. The way they work being practically the same, let's simply study oscillator 1. The choice of the oscillator's wave shape as well as the intensity of its volume isn't made in the VCO section of the oscillator as such, but here in the VCF's filter section. So we find here the two little round knobs associated to each oscillator. When the knob is pulled to the left, it's the sawtooth wave that will be heard. The more the knob is pulled, the louder will be the volume. By bringing this knob to the center via double click, there's no more sound. If we wish to hear the square wave, we need to push this button to the right. Thus, the square wave volume increases proportionally. As we can hear, we find the brassy side of the sawtooth wave and the more hollow side of the square wave. These sound characteristics come from various harmonic spectrums of both kinds of waves, the square wave generating only the odd harmonics of the spectrum in relation to the sawtooth wave. In the oscillator section, The modulations knob enables to apply a frequencies oscillators modulation or a modulation on the square wave's pulse width when it's this kind of wave that is selected here in the VCF section. The switch here enables us to choose among three sources of modulation, that is, a modulation coming from the envelope 1, another coming from the LFO, and one coming from the LFO2. For example, let's leave it on LFO and let's pull the knob toward the left in order to generate a modulation of the oscillator's frequency coming from the LFO. Now we hear a periodic variation of the musical pitch of the oscillator. This variation comes from this low frequency oscillator here, which is a very low wave in frequency. The wave delivered by the LFO is not heard as such, it's the effect that this wave generates on the oscillator 1's frequency that we hear. This is what creates these wave movements on the sound's musical pitch. The modulation scale here is not very big, even with the modulation gain pushed to the maximum. However, this enables to reproduce easily the classic human voice vibratos in order to render the musical line with a more singing tone. The vibrato speed is controlled by the LFO's rotary knob here. Let's use the square wave now on this oscillator 1. We hear the same type of modulation now on the square wave's frequency. Let's push the modulation knob toward the right and let's notice that it is now the pulse width which is modulated in a cycle way at the LFO1 speed. We can understand better what is the pulse width by reaching the modulation and by studying the knob named pulse width here. When it's at 0, the crest and the hollow of the square wave both take 50% of the oscillation period's width. It's a pure square wave. We can enlarge the crest in relation to the hollow by pushing the knob like this. We notice that this also has the effect to change the harmonic character of the sound and so to change its tone. With this kind of pulse width, we are near, for example, the harpsichord's tone, funky clavinet, etc. Let's know the pulse width at 10% will inverse the widths of the crests and hollows, but it provides the same sound tone. The movement that I dictate to this knob can be automatically generated internally by the LFO1 by pulling the modulations knob toward the right as we understood. By the modulation source selector, we can, in addition to the LFO1, choose the LFO2 or the envelope 1 for the oscillator 1 and the envelope 2 for the oscillator 2. The envelopes and the LFO2 will be detailed later. Between both oscillators is found a switch which enables to synchronize the oscillator 2 with the oscillator 1. On this graphic, we see two waves that are not synchronized as for their periods. We notice that the oscillator 1, tune lower, releases 4 oscillation periods, whereas oscillator 2, higher, releases about 10. Now let's synchronize oscillator 2 with oscillator 1 and we notice that the oscillator 2 periods are cut each time an oscillation period ends on oscillator 1. In this way, this brings a new periodic wave drawing on the oscillator 2 and a particular tone sound as well. Let's go hear that on the Oberheim SEM V. Let's activate only the oscillator 2. Let's move its frequency a little and realize that the fundamental frequency as well as their associated harmonics follow well the changes in frequency generated by the frequency's oscillator. Now let's activate the oscillator's synchronization and realize that the fundamental on the analyzer doesn't move anymore even if we move the oscillator's frequency. Why? Because it is synchronized to the oscillator like what we have understood on this graphic. However, we notice that subtle changes take place on the harmonic signal, and this provides different tones. The oscillator synchronization is particularly effective when we rapidly move the oscillator's frequency like this. Even more effective if we control this sync oscillator's frequency with the help of the modulation wheel passing by the matrix, for instance. Later, we'll see also how an envelope can be effective as a modulation source on the pulse width. In this synchronization context, if we want to tune the oscillator 2, it will be necessary to use the oscillator 1 frequency since the oscillator 2 slave is synchronized on master oscillator 1. We can, of course, have the oscillator 1 sound be heard at the same time as the one from oscillator 2 synchronized like this. Before studying the filter, the envelopes, the LFO2, etc., let's take a look and land an ear on the sub oscillator present here. The sub oscillator is not an independent oscillator. It is linked to the oscillator 1. It may deliver a sine wave, a saw wave, or square wave with pulse width modulation and this 1 or 2 lower octaves in relation to the oscillator 1. For example, in the VCF section, let's activate the oscillator 1 volume. To be able to hear the sub oscillator, you need to pull the EXT knob here toward the sub oscillator. As we notice on the analyzer, and as we hear it, a 1 octave lower frequency is now created via this sub oscillator. If we change the oscillator 1's frequency, the sub oscillator's frequency will follow consequently also. We can place this sub oscillator 2 octaves lower in relation to the oscillator 1 like this. We can, if we wish, to hear only this sub oscillator by doing what's required here on the VCF. A reminder, by double-clicking on a button, it brings it back to its neutral default value, and so here enables to turn off the oscillator 1's volume. Now we only hear the sub oscillator. We can change its wave shape, as well as its pulse width when the square wave is selected. This sub oscillator is practical in reinforcing the base of oscillator 1. When the modulation matrix will be studied, we will make a final example where the 3 oscillators will be heard at the same time. The last of the sound sources that this synthesizer can generate is the classic noise, available by pushing the knob here to the right. This noise can be useful in multiple situations. It can be used to create percussive sounds, to dirty the oscillator's sound, to create flute blows attacks, or to generate these filtered classic noises. Talking about filters, let's use in what follows this noise as a sound source to demonstrate the multimode filters impact that we find on the Oberheim SEM V.